mentioned the Amazons and Netflixes of the world a lot. I keep thinking, if I got $1,000 a month, why wouldn't I just go and spend it all on Amazon? Is there anything besides taxing these big companies more that we need to do? Do we need to, as a lot of other candidates have said, break up big tech?
There has been excessive consolidation in the technology industry, and it's bad for us on many levels. We should be forcing some of these technology companies to divest parts of themselves. We should also be prohibiting them from acquiring certain types of businesses, because right now in Silicon Valley, the business model is not to build the next great company. The business model is to get gobbled up by one of the behemoths for $1 billion, and then everyone's rich and goes home, and it doesn't really matter what they did to your technology. That said, breaking up Amazon, as an example, would not magically revive the main streets of Indiana. And there are many fields in technology where there will naturally be one or maybe two winners. And the example I used in one of the debates was, no one wants to use Bing today, or no one wants to use the fourth best navigation app. We all just want to use the one that has the best information on it. And so saying we're going to keep breaking you up anytime one of you wins does not make sense in some of these contexts. It also does not solve some of the biggest problems that we're actually seeing in tech. So again, if you're a parent, you're concerned that your kid's brain is being rewired by screens and smartphone use. They are being rewired. We've seen record high levels of anxiety and depression that are in lockstep with increased adoption of smartphones and social media apps. You know who don't let their kids use screens? The people in Silicon Valley. If you go there, you will see there are no screens in sight in these households, because they know what they're doing. Tristan Harris said, we have the smartest engineers in the country turning supercomputers into dopamine delivery devices for teenagers. So the question is, how do we get into the guts of these tech companies and protect our kids from having their brains changed in ways that are quite negative? If you were to go around saying break up big tech, that actually does not change the mechanics of the social media app. You have to have a department of the attention economy with very smart people like Tristan who go in and actually say, look, here are the 20 design decisions you made. You're going to make them all differently. So saying you're going to go around breaking up big tech is a pretend solution. It's a 20th century solution to 21st century problems. If you home in on the actual problems you're trying to solve, you see you need a different approach. You need a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, in many of these cases.
I have a few questions about getting into the guts of those internet harms or device harms, starting with privacy, for which I think you've proposed what people call data ownership.
Yes.
So I think some would say maybe that the problem that we have with privacy is privacy being treated as a commodity in the first place, rather than as some sort of right that you can't trade away. I guess I'd like to hear a little more about what data ownership actually looks like and how it addresses the harms we see of people looking at these confusing terms of service, giving their quote-unquote consent, and then really having no idea what's going on.
I love the way you framed this, Molly, because I've never met a human who actually reads those things and then walks away and says, I didn't like that particular turn of phrase, I'm not going to consent to this. I mean, it is fake consent. You're just looking at it saying, all right, get out of my way, I'm going to click on it, and then hope you don't do anything too bad with my data. Because the bargaining power is so extremely one-sided. I mean, you have quasi-monopolies in these tech fields where you feel like, what are you going to do, not use Facebook? I mean, like, is that like a real option? Like, what is the alternative if you want to keep in touch with your neighbors and college classmates? So the way that I would turn this around is I would say, look, we're allowed, of course, to loan our data to these technology companies, and we're not going to make every American contract expert or privacy expert, but we're going to put the power in your hands and say, if you loan your data to these companies, then here's what you know will happen. Number one, there is an audit trail where you will know what they did with your data, particularly if they sold or resold it. Number two, if they get money for your data, you get some too. It just gets slipped into your account. Like, on a monthly basis. And then you'll feel better about the fact that it's getting sold and resold. Number 3, you are allowed to turn it off anytime you want. You can walk away and have the right of anonymity and say, hey, my data no longer appears if I don't want it to. Now, the way this would work out for 98% of Americans is they would still just click that box, go use the app. They would never look at the audit trail, but they would feel some degree of comfort that it exists, and they would get money. So that would be a dramatic improvement. And from the government's point of view, it would be a dramatic improvement to have the audit trail, because then you can look at it and say, okay, I now know what these companies are doing with our data, which right now we don't. Right now we just hope for the best. I go to Americans around the country and I say, hey, how many of you actually change your password after you get notified that your company's been hacked? And only half of people do. It's like they're too busy to worry about the fact that Yahoo got hacked and their password might have been compromised. So right now the inequities are ridiculously one-sided. I would put the power back into Americans' hands, but I think most Americans are creatures of convenience. We just want to know that our information's not being abused and exploited.
And you don't think that there's any role for government to say, hey, here are ways that information is abused and is exploited, let's outlaw it, so that Americans who are kind of currently drowning in the control they have but don't know how to exercise over their data are protected anyway?
Yes, the government should put the power in the hands of the consumers, and what I would want is for a consumer to at some point essentially just have one choice. It's like, do you want your data use and protection to be like low, medium, or high? And you can change that election at a particular point, and then the tech companies treat you differently based upon which dial you put it to, and you get a different amount of money. So if you put it to high, it's like you can aggressively use my data to some extent, and I'll get more money. And then as low as like, then you have to anonymize it, like you can't really use it for a lot of things, and I get next to no money. So at least then Americans have a basic sense as to what their preference is and how it's expressed, like how the company actually adjusts.
Okay. So the percentage of, ask you about immigration.
Sure.
Percentage of Americans who were born somewhere else is almost 14% today. It's the highest in a century. It's triple what it was in the 1970s. And we would argue, and from what I've seen, you would certainly argue, those immigrants have made the United States a more vibrant place, more dynamic place culturally and economically in many ways. But certainly there's also been a contribution to social divisions, and those have been exploited by the president, among others. So what percentage, is there a percentage of immigrants, is there a percentage of foreign-born residents in the United States that's too high? If it's 14% today, or almost 14%, is 15% a problem? Is 20% a problem? At what point, is there a breaking point in terms of the number of Americans who are or residents who are born elsewhere?
I'm the son of immigrants myself, so I agree that immigrants make our country stronger, more dynamic, economically, culturally, socially. That said, I think we should have a rational, principled approach to immigration. At the high end, we should be stapling a green card to the diploma of any student who comes here and studies at one of our universities and graduates, because a lot of them want to stay here, and we should be encouraging them to stay here and make it easier for them to start a business, start a family, have a life here. We should try to provide a path to citizenship for the 12 million plus people who are here and undocumented, and bring them in to our society, essentially have another legal classification on this path. I think it would be wrong to set like a numerical goal and say, well, you can't have foreign-born Americans above this threshold, because in my mind, of these people you're describing, they're all going to have kids like me and my brother, probably like immediately, not immediately, but like the next generation, like all of a sudden they're born in this country, like, and then that's, then they're, in my mind, as American as anyone else. So we should have goals that we're trying to achieve with immigration, but I don't think that there's like a numerical target we should be setting either positively or negatively.
So then how do you manage these tensions that have clearly arisen, partly in society, partly from the level of immigration that's gone up so much in 40 years?
Well, it's gone up for a host of reasons, and a lot of that has been illegal immigration across the border. And so we need to enforce our borders in a real way. It's one of the reasons, one of the multitude of reasons why Americans have given up on government is because they feel like we have policies on the books, but then those policies aren't actually enacted in real life. This to me is one of the actual responsibilities of government, is to say, look, we can actually deliver on enforcing a southern border that lives up to its name, like as an actual border. If we were to do that, then I believe the confidence level in the American people would increase immeasurably about immigration.
Mr. Yang, can I ask you to drill down a little bit more on this? Because at the start of this conversation, you were talking about the problems that the federal government could be addressing and should be addressing.
Yep.
You were talking about your freedom dividend, and I was struck by a phrase that you used, which was getting the freedom dividend, quote, as a right of citizenship.
Yep.
And it made me think, and maybe I have this at the top of my head because I interviewed him yesterday, but Jonathan Metzl of Vanderbilt University has written the book Dying of Whiteness. And his whole argument is people are willing to die rather than be connected to or finance policies that they believe are giving resources to people they view as undeserving. So what I would love for you to do is to please talk about how you'd address the clear societal hurdles to achieving the goals that you set out.
Oh, sure. So, none of you had heard of me 8-10 months ago, I'd imagine. And I'm sitting here having outperformed half a dozen sitting senators, governors, members of Congress. And so you have to ask yourself, how did that happen? And it happened because I'm laser focused on the real problems that Americans see around us every day, many of which led directly to Donald Trump being elected. Right now I'm fifth in the polls, rising, fastest growing candidate or campaign in the race. So if we follow this through, I surprise in Iowa, perform extraordinarily well in New Hampshire, I become President of the United States in 2021. Everyone would know that I won on the freedom dividend because that's my signature proposal. Americans decided that $1,000 a month in cash is pretty great. And so then as president, I'm there celebrating with Democrats and progressives because they're just thrilled to have beaten Donald Trump. They realized it was a bit of a bet, but it worked, and here we are. And then the Republicans and conservatives in Congress will look up and say, wait a minute, how do I feel about this dividend? A lot of people in my district seem very excited about it. The one state that's had a dividend for almost 40 years, Alaska, is a deep red conservative state, and it was passed by a Republican governor. This is a big win for rural areas that are struggling, and red states on the interior that have gotten blasted by automation. And so we just need some of these Republican congressmen to say, I am for the dividend because I'm for economic freedom. And if you get a majority, then you can pass it. Now, can you get all of them? Almost certainly not. But this is a law like any other, so you don't need a supermajority. You just need a congressional majority to pass the bill.
One could argue that when President Obama came into office, he was laser focused on getting health care to as many people as possible, and Obamacare passed, but those Republicans, no Republican voted for it in the House. I'm having a hard time seeing how you're going to break the fever that President Obama thought he was going to do in 2012 simply by your election. How are you going to convince the Americans who are literally willing to die or or stay in dire economic circumstances simply because policies that you'd want to put into place and others want to put into place would benefit someone else?
I think that the attitude you're describing, while it does apply to a certain subset of Americans, applies to a very, very low proportion of them. And I'm confident of this because when I campaign around the country, at every event I go to, someone comes up to me in the line afterwards and says, "I voted for Donald Trump. This time I'm voting for you." One survey in New Hampshire said that 10% of the voters who voted for Trump would vote for me over Trump in the general election. Another survey said that 18% of college Republicans would choose me over the president. Now, this is not everyone, but this is enough. You don't need to convert 80% of the president's followers. You need to convert, let's call it 20%. So this attitude that you're describing is very real, but I believe that it does not contain 100% of the folks who voted for Donald Trump. And I know this because, again, they come to me at my events every single time and say, "You're my candidate this time." I also believe I'm somewhat different from some of the other Democrats in the field, and I can't speak to Obama, but I've been on Fox News any number of times. I'll talk to anyone. And one friend of mine, whose mother is an avid Fox viewer, said that Yang is the only Democrat I would support because he is the only one who does not seem to be judging me. That is enough for us to get a critical mass of Donald Trump supporters to get around a solution that would dramatically improve their way of life. They can see it. The second argument I'd make is that cash is much, much harder to demonize than healthcare. If you go to a conservative in Kentucky and say, the government wants to take over your healthcare, you can get people very, very upset about that. If you say, hey, this cash is going to hurt you, it's going to be tougher. I mean, there might be someone there who's like, yeah, that cash is going to hurt me. But others would be like, wait a minute. They do this in Alaska. If I got that money, I think I'd be very productive with it. Sure, some of my neighbors less so, but, like, first things first. So we can get Americans on board because it's such a simple, straightforward vision of citizenship. And I've run organizations for decades now, and what I say to people is this: there are three ways you can treat human beings who work in your organization. Number one, you do nothing. Then they leave you within a year. Number two, you tell them how great they are. That lasts for about a year, and then they leave you before the second year. The third thing you can do is you invest in them, you compensate them, you give them raises, and you genuinely value them, and then they'll stay with you forever. Right now in the United States of America, we're doing some combination of 1 and 2 with our kids. We're saying, hey, things are great, you can vote. They don't really believe it. If you could look at every parent who could then look at their children and say, when you turn 18, you're going to get $1,000 a month from your country because your country loves you, your country values you, and we are investing in you. That is a game changer for Americans of every political party. And there are many people in red states who are already embracing this vision. I know because I see them every day.
Can I just follow up on why you're still here and why we've heard of you?
Sure.
You said it's because you're focusing on problems that people care about, which I'm sure is right. But you also hear a lot of people say, oh, he sounds like a normal person. Smart person maybe, but a human being, unlike most politicians. And I'm just curious why you think most politicians don't sound like normal people, and as you go up in the polls, do you find yourself under pressure not to, or, I mean, what's the process been like and for you?
Thank you. It's a really important question. I went through that tension a little bit earlier in the process. I clearly see why politicians do not seem like normal people, because they're surrounded by organizations whose livelihoods are dependent upon this person's political career. And so they deliver it to the candidate, okay, here are your talking points, go to them, do not go beyond these guardrails, and if you do go beyond these guardrails, then people will throw rocks at you for at least a day, and maybe your career will be over. And then all of our careers will be over. So if you're surrounded by that kind of organization and message, then you become very, very guarded pretty quickly. You have your talking points, you deliver them, and Americans can sense it. It's a variant of what I was talking about with the universities, but this is actually the big problem in American life. And I'm going to extend it to you all as journalists. Almost 2,000 local newspapers have gone out of business in the last number of years. Why? Because all of the advertising revenue went to the internet. The local businesses that used to advertise in those papers disappeared. They got zeroed out. Did journalism become less valuable during this time? Well, yes, according to the marketplace. Like, the marketplace says it's worth zero, then it's worth zero. And the theme of my campaign is, of course, journalism is not worth zero just because the market says it's worth zero. You need journalism to have a functioning democracy. How are you going to vote on things going on in your community if you don't have a local paper? So this is what's going on with politicians, is that politicians have very, very clear institutional incentives, and then they go to them. It's like the marketplace for politicians. What are their upside for seeming like a human being? Actually quite low, because at some point they're going to say something that someone doesn't like, and then everyone will mock them, and there'll be a negative press cycle, and their staff will be like, you can never do that again. Or then what are your incentives for like staying on the straight and narrow? That's like, then you get more success, more cable news appearances, like your team pats you on the back and says, great job, you didn't say anything that was off your talking points. So our politicians seem increasingly like flies stuck in amber. And it's one reason why Trump won, is because even though he is a narcissist reality TV star in many Americans sense that he has massive character problems, he struck people as quote-unquote more authentic than our politicians. And it's because our system has become overrun by these market and institutional incentives that have pummeled the humanity out of otherwise well-meaning public servants. I experienced this myself when I was rising. Like, I acted like a human being when no one cared. No one was watching me, it didn't matter. I got like a little bit of visibility, and then some negative press cycles, and then people were like, hey, maybe you should like stick to the script. And then I stuck to the script for a little while, and then it didn't work for us. So then I started evincing more humanity again, and then we started rising again. And then here we are. And now I'm happy to say, like, I get to act like myself and like a human being most all of the time, because it's worked for us. It's actually our major competitive advantage relative to the field, that I seem like a human being speaking English in terms that most of us can understand. And that's what we need right now. I mean, so thank you for the question.
So do you ever run into people who say, hey, we tried the non-traditional last time with Donald Trump. That didn't work out so well, so I'm a little bit leery about you?
Yeah, I do get that.
What do you say?
And what I say to them, I've got a few responses. Number one is I say, look, I'd be the last person who would say I'm going to run government like a business, because they're two completely different things with different leadership styles, and anyone who thinks otherwise is a moron. And then I say running government will be much closer to what I did running a national nonprofit that had thousands of stakeholders, where you have to try and generate consensus and galvanize energy around a vision that will get people excited. The other thing I say is that Donald Trump is not every non-politician in the world, that there are actually many people that are sound human beings who just want to solve problems, and he should not represent every person who's not spent a career in politics. And number three, I say that Americans have been looking for some kind of change agent for years now, because we sense that our government is behind the curve. And that's not just Trump and Bernie Sanders' outsized success, but you can even see that in Barack Obama's election in 2008, where people were hungry for some form of change, and we're still looking for it. And the fact is that change is unlikely to come from someone who has spent decades on Capitol Hill.
And even though you are still able to act as a human, you're also having to say the same thing again and again. I'm sure every question we've asked, you've heard before, and you've explained the freedom dividend. And so how do you do that without sounding bored or getting bored with yourself?
Well, part of it is I don't have any talking points. So if you were to watch 100 interviews with me, there'd be a lot of similarities, no doubt. But there's something different about each one of them because I would go insane otherwise. So I might get an identical question and answer it differently depending upon the day. Honestly, because I'm a human being, and sometimes something else is more appealing.
Foreign policy. I went through your answers to the Council on Foreign Relations, and I was struck by several times where you said the U.S. response to something should be to join the chorus of other countries. And in particular, it struck me as an interesting model for what the U.S. role in the world should be. And I, in particular, when you were asked what should the U.S. do about Xinjiang in China, you said the U.S. should join the chorus of countries that are calling China out. So I guess my question is that all?
That's not all. What we have to do is regenerate our global leadership role through investing in our historic partnerships and alliances. If we want to improve China's treatment of its ethnic minorities, which is reprehensible, to me, you could go it alone, or you could try and build an international consensus around it. I would go for path number 2, and I would actually try and strengthen that consensus in ways that would be important to the Chinese, which is why I'm proposing a World Data Organization that's analogous to the WTO. If you look at our recent past, China modified its behavior significantly because it thought it was important to join the WTO, and that ended up being positive in some ways for the rest of the world. We need to bring similar pressure in their use of technology and data. And if the Chinese feel like they need to conform to certain standards in order to achieve their economic goals, then they'll be much more likely to actually feel pressure to pull back in some of their abuses. So I don't want to relinquish American global leadership. I want to rebuild American global leadership by actually strengthening our alliances and partnerships and let our friends know that Donald Trump is not forever. We're here and open for business.
Also in the world.
Time check, we need to run.
Okay. Abby in Woodstock, New York asked, how would you handle non-state terrorist groups like ISIS while getting us out of forever wars?
When I talk to Americans, they do not want us to be in a constant state of armed conflict as we've been for 19 years and counting. There are ways that we can combat ISIS that don't involve semi-permanent occupation of certain territories. So I have a 3-part test for armed intervention. Number 1, there's a clear national interest at stake or the ability to avert a humanitarian crisis. Number 2, there's a clearly defined timeline where we can bring our troops out. And number 3, we have allies and partners that are willing to join us in the mission. Something like ISIS would satisfy all 3, where there is a clear national interest, we should be able to define a timeline, and if we have partners and allies that are willing to join us in that mission, which we do in that case, then we'll be able to act in concert. So I do not want to engage in forever wars. Sorry?
You can define a timeline maybe to destroy the caliphate, but ISIS hasn't gone away. There are Islamist terrorist groups in Northern Africa, in Afghanistan, and a lot of people in the military would say without some presence on the ground, gathering intelligence and responding, they can't contain those threats on a continuing basis. Is that wrong?
Well, even then, when you say continuing basis, I mean, you can define a timeline. Like, the timeline could be prolonged and measured in years and still be the right mission.